So the laws around Airbnb and short-term rentals are changing all the time. And if you as an investor or host don't have a plan for what to do when they change, or an investment strategy to go to places where they're not going to change, it could come back to bite you really, really hard. So I had a conversation actually on Bigger Pockets the other day with someone who was considering investing in Florida around Disney. And they were asking about where to invest. And we were specifically talking about legislation. Now, I manage Airbnbs on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, but there are similarities between this market and things that you can pull and you can use if you're a host or an investor in really any market that's out there. And the conversation that I had went something like this. They were asking about areas and the different kind of legislation. And I said, there's really three kinds of zones in regards to Airbnb. Zone number one is the kind of area where the local municipality or whoever is making the laws in regards to short-term rentals has just said, nope, we're not going to do it. Flat, no. They'll put some kind of restriction like a 30-day or a 90-day minimum stay, or other restrictions. Some places are more strict. Think like Jackson Hole would be one example of most of that area. Very, very, very hard to operate a legal short-term rental. New York would be another one, to use a big city in a small town. So obviously, if you're an investor or a host, that's kind of off on its own. We don't want to invest there if we can't run a legal business, okay? Zone number two is the kind of place where some legislation has been passed, but not a ton. There are still a lot of conversations to be had. Now, these kind of areas, these aren't official zones, by the way, and this was something that the individual that I was talking to asked. It's like, can you find this? Is it zone 1, zone 2, or zone 3? These are things that you kind of have to go in and talk to a property manager or other hosts or other investors or a real estate agent and kind of ask what the situation is and then puzzle it out yourself. Obviously, pretty easy to figure out if there's laws against short-term rental, that it's in that zone. Okay. Zone number two, though, is the kind of area, maybe it's an up-and-coming market, maybe it's on the outside, kind of the fringe of a heavy STR zone. And it's an area that might be rapidly expanding and it might look really, really attractive. But these areas, I call them gray zones just because you don't know what is going to happen with the legislation regarding Airbnb. And I'll give you an example. When Airbnb came on the scene, there were a lot of markets where people they just exploded for Airbnb because they figured out that they could make a lot more money on Airbnb than renting long term. And that was great for hosts and great for guests, frankly, because they got lots of options. But then the city or the county or the state or whoever controls that municipality would come in and they would say, holy cow, we have this housing shortage of long-term rentals and everyone is doing short-term. And so they would pass this broad sweeping legislation outlawing short-term rentals or the use of Airbnb. And sometimes those units would get grandfathered in, sometimes they wouldn't, right? And so if you're in an area where this has not happened yet, where there hasn't been a lot of the conversation, where they don't have a robust permitting process, you are at risk for, if your market grows and a ton of people invest there, that's a lot of people would think that's really good for you. And it can be. I'm not saying it's not. But you run the risk of if everyone buys an Airbnb and it catches the attention of the wrong people and they decide that they want to act against short-term rentals and they want to cut back on supply for whatever reason, then you could be at risk of not being able to operate your business. And then at that point, you are sitting on an asset and you have a mortgage to pay and you have to pivot to a midterm or a long-term rental strategy. Now, that's zone number two. Zone number three is an area generally like a resort zone, a heavy tourism area where all of these conversations have already been had. Now, a lot of people online, depending on who you listen to, will tell you to stay away from these areas because the competition is high. You might face higher property taxes, other things like that. And they have a point, but generally those same people are advocating for you to go into new markets like the Midwest that maybe haven't had the growth of Airbnb. They don't, these municipalities have not had to deal with a high volume of Airbnbs. And while that does allow you some advantages, you can come in, there's low competition as far as other hosts. Like if you want to buy an Airbnb in Florida by Disney, you're going to have crazy amounts of competition, both in volume and in quality, right? Because there's a ton of Airbnbs and there's a ton of really nice Airbnbs. There are people who've gone all out in theming and it's all Disney, and they've done really, really cool things with their Airbnbs. And the difficulty is that you're going to have to compete with that. The upside, though, is that you're not there. I can't say you're not going to be affected by future legislation, but there's a significantly lower risk of being affected by future legislation. And the reason is because all of the conversation around Airbnbs and what are we going to do about short-term rentals, that's already happened. And the municipality has established a process. They've said, hey, we're going to levy these property taxes on short-term rentals. We're going to have this permitting process. And these are all revenue generation streams, and that adds stability to your business. It might cut into your profits a little bit, but it adds stability to your business in a couple of ways. One, the conversations have already been had. And that's just a huge green flag for me when I look at an area, is that they've already had this conversation, they've already made a decision, and that lends a certain degree of longevity for me if I'm coming in there and I say, okay, I'm realistically, they've made this decision and I'm probably going to be able to operate my business into the future for many, many years to come without interruption. The other thing is from the perspective of the municipality, if they have a process for this, they're getting money from these short-term rentals. And if they choose to change that process in the future, then that's going to cut into their bottom line. And so that further decreases the likelihood. Not only have they already had this conversation, but they're getting money from it. So if they choose to go back on that in the future, they're going to take a pay cut. And most local governments don't want that, because when it boils down to dollars and cents, you might have some people who are saying, hey, we want less Airbnbs, but by the time it actually makes it to the local government, they look at it and they're like, well, this actually makes us a fair bit of money and we don't want to change it. So that is zone 3. And so to bring this specifically, if you're looking, like I said, I operate on the island of Oahu. So on Oahu, we have resort zones. We have Waikiki, we have Ko Olina, and then we have up on the North Shore, we have Turtle Bay. And these areas are zoned generally as resort areas where you can legally do nightly rentals. Now, there's kind of a gray zone with the rest of the island where it's zone 2/zone 3. You have to do, currently, it's a 30-day minimum stay. And they just passed legislation that's looking like they're going to switch to a 90-day minimum stay, right? And that's an example of what I was talking about before, where if you bought in those areas thinking, hey, I can rent month to month, there's plenty of people who are, wanting to come to Hawaii and stay for a month. If that legislation changes and you now have to rent for an entire quarter, that could significantly impact your bottom line, and you could be stuck holding the bag or having to pivot to a long-term rental strategy that maybe won't get you the returns that you were planning on in advance. So I'm not telling you what to do, and there's different strategies that are right for different investors and different risk profiles. But if you're in that zone 2, you might want to consider making sure that it pencils as a long-term rental, or that you have a backup strategy for how to fill it if legislation changes in the future. And if you really want to do an STR, buy a short-term rental and put it on Airbnb or VRBO or one of these other OTAs and have it on there for a really, really long time into the future and have stability in that, you might want to consider going to an area or a market that has some stability, where these conversations have already been had. And sure, you might pay a little bit more in permitting and property taxes. You might have a little stiffer competition, but you have a stability to your business into the future that's going to help you sleep well at night. And sleep is the foundation of health, guys.